Hey gang, today I wanted to talk about one of those questions that comes up a lot. How do I make my video look like film? And you're going to be surprised at how simple the answer is. Well, before we get to the simple answer, we probably ought to talk about some differences between film and video. First of all, in film, it has something called grain. Grain comes from the fact that film is an organic process. You're using a chemical process to expose these halide crystals, and when those crystals are exposed to light, they react to the light, and then when you print that film, those crystals on the film are processed and are turned into something that we can visually see. There are a lot of different types of chemicals and a lot of different types of films that you can create. Some of them are more sensitive to light. They have very large crystals. Others are not so sensitive to light, and they have very, very tight crystals. And this is what creates that grain pattern. And when something is super sensitive to light, it's usually of a cheaper quality. And so you see something that looks really, really grainy because it's very low light. And what happens is the grain pattern is not consistent across the film itself. And so as that film is run through the projector, those film grain appear to move and kind of give a secondary light or life to what you are seeing. If you ever get a chance to see the original Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, in its original format, it looks very much a product of the 1970s. It has a grain to it. It has a life that is there, and it looks, to me, looks very, very wonderful. However, if you try to watch Star Wars now, getting it off Disney Plus or the iTunes store or 4K or wherever you're getting your copy of Star Wars, it is an enhanced version. It is a cleaned up version. And one of the things that they have done is they've gone in and removed all of the grain, or as much of the grain as they possibly can. And as a result, if you watch the cleaned up, currently restored, quote unquote, restored version of Star Wars Episode 4, at times it looks like you're watching video because it's all that grain has been removed. And that's one of the things about video. Video is made up of pixels. Pixels are consistent. There's 1920 by 1080 or 3000 or 5K by 5K, whatever that may be. That pixel pattern doesn't change. And so because of that, it has a very different look. You could add a grain look in post. That is something that is quite achievable, but it often doesn't look as organic as the real deal. So one thing that you could do if you're trying to make your film or your video look more like film is to add a post grain effect to your project. And remember, not all grain is visible. If you're looking at really cheap film, the grain is going to be visible because it's using a cheaper solution. The grains or the crystals are much larger. But if you're shooting on 70 millimeter film or really high quality film, that grain is going to be super, super tight, and it's going to look more realistic. That's why the IMAX films looks so incredible, is because the grain pattern on that film is so tight and so tiny. But if you're trying to make your video look more like film, you could add grain in post. And most editing applications have some kind of grain filter to add that onto your video or to match video elements to existing film footage. That being said, most films today are not shot on film. They're shot on video. But there are some other processes that we can examine to make our video look more film-like. One of those is sharpness. Film is soft. Again, it's organic. And what happens is light tends to wrap around objects. You can't really try this if you don't have a film camera, but if you have film, you could put a light like the sun. Go back and look at photographs from the 1970s all the way up until about 1985, 86 of portraits of people out in the sun, and look at how the sun, as it is behind someone as a rim light or a hard rim light or a hard side light, look at how their hair glows and lights up and wraps around the subject. Film has that natural process. Video is generally sharp, a lot of sharp edges. This is due to the pixels that are in the image. We can create very hard edges around all of our subjects. Has to do with the contrast, has to do with the pixel placement, those kinds of things. So one thing we could do to our video image to make it look more film-like is to soften it just a little bit, to turn the sharpness down a little bit. Now, you could do this in camera. In fact, if you are using a digital SLR, many digital SLR quote-unquote experts, one of the first things that they suggest that you do with your digital SLR camera is turn down the sharpness when you're shooting video down to low, to the 0 setting. Canon SLR, digital SLR users may have seen Philip Bloom do a discussion on this in the past, and one of the first things he does is he turns that sharpness way down to soften it up just a little bit so it looks more film-like. Another big difference between film and video, of course, is the contrast range and the gamma. Film certainly has a much higher contrast range than video. Of course, this has improved dramatically over the years. We have seen cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K and the 6K has a tremendous contrast range. And not too long ago, cameras would have had somewhere between a 10-to-1 contrast range, basically 10 steps between the darkest area of the screen and the lightest area of the screen. But now, thanks to Camera Raw, thanks to things like improved sensors, we're starting to see that contrast range expand to where we're able to get 13 steps of contrast, 16 steps of contrast, 20 steps of contrast. The more contrast that we have, the more steps we have between the lightest and the darkest area of our frame, the more film-like we can make this, the more we're able to see into the blacks. Unfortunately, video tends to crush the blacks and crush the whites, meaning that once you start to get into things that are too dark, suddenly everything is the same shade of black. Or if you get too much into bright areas, suddenly the sky becomes, instead of various shades of blue and white puffy clouds, suddenly the sky is overexposed and everything is white, and you really can't see any detail in that. But as we get cameras that have better contrast range, the more detail we're able to pull out in those areas. So if there's a way to improve the contrast range of your camera, certainly use it. Again, I think Philip Bloom has a tutorial on dialing down the contrast on your camera, or shoot in RAW. RAW will actually try to give you more information in those blacks and whites. The Canon EOS R currently right now has a camera raw footage, or a Canon raw footage. Sony, I believe, has one, and certainly the Blackmagic cameras, as we've talked about, have this raw footage file format that tries to get more information in the blacks and the whites so that you can then stretch that out and get a good contrast range to make it look more like film. There are some things like motion artifacts. Film typically is 24 frames per second. Video, because of the nature of syncing the video signal going all the way back to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, has typically run at 30 frames per second, or, for those of you that want to be pedantic, 29.97, right? The reason for that is because of the power cycle here in the United States, which runs at 60 hertz. So if you have two different fields, you combine those at 60 hertz, you combine those together, that's 30 frames per second, or 29.97. This is why in other countries, PAL systems like Europe, where they have 50 hertz as their electronic grid cycle system, that's why they run at 25 frames per second. So if you've ever seen something that was shot on PAL and then converted to NTSC, or a National Television Standards Committee, 30 frames per second, it looks very film-like. And in the early days of DV video, many people were buying the PAL video cameras because it shot at 25 frames per second, which is only 1 frame larger than the 24 frames per second, which gave the video a more film-like presence. Today, digital SLR cameras and many DV cameras have the ability to shoot at 24 frames per second or even 23.97. If you can shoot in 24 frames per second, I would highly encourage you to do that if you want to make it look more film-like. That being said, there are some people who always encourage you, regardless of what your final output might be, to always shoot in 24 frames per second, especially if you're doing post work. A good friend of mine who does a lot of motion graphics and animation work has said that all of the stuff that he does is always 24 frames per second because it literally saves hard drive space. And if you're shooting 24 frames per second, it might also save you a little bit of hard drive space. 6 frames per second over a minute. What is that? That is 360 frames that you save of information. 360 frames of information. Let's say it's at 2 megabytes per frame. It's probably larger than that. We're just going to use this as an example. That's over 720 megabytes of information that's saved just in that 1 minute. So it might be something to consider and might be something that you want to test out. But getting back to differences between film and video, if you want to make your video look more like film, then shoot at 24 frames per second. Color timing, I think a lot of people today would know this more of color processing or color matching or applying a look or a LUT, a lookup table, to their video. Color correcting, color processing, whatever the term might be, they're not always used in the correct way. But film is intentionally shot with the knowledge that it's going to be tweaked in post, that you're going to have to push and pull that image quite a bit to make it look really, really good. Video can be tweaked, but as you may have seen in your own projects, it can be a little hard to do because there are certain limits. You can only go so high into the whites or so low into the blacks before that information is lost completely. Again, this is another reason why shooting in camera raw is valuable because it doesn't care about contrast. It doesn't really care a lot about color. It's caring a lot about bringing in that raw information so that then you can process it later. And if you did have a chance to shoot with any of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K footage, you know that when you bring it into your editing application, it looks very, very flat. In fact, it looks very unflattering until you take a moment and you start working with the color correcting tools that Premiere or other nonlinear applications have. And then suddenly you're able to make this video that you've shot, this raw video, look fantastic, look dramatic, and look incredible compared to what you might have just shot on the normal default settings on your camera. So again, I guess you're kind of starting to hear in these last couple of slides that I'm really encouraging you to shoot in camera raw whenever possible. Now, that being said, camera raw is different depending on the manufacturer. Blackmagic is shooting in their Blackmagic RAW. Canon shoots in Canon RAW. Some will shoot in C-Log or S-Log. So you need to really look at your camera manufacturer and see if the camera that you have, number one, shoots in RAW and what type of RAW it shoots in, because that will tell you how you're going to be able to tweak it in post. But certainly as we have more cameras that have the ability to shoot camera raw, that gives you a lot more flexibility, very much like film, for tweaking it in post and getting the correct color timing the way you want it. I mentioned earlier in this lecture about bloom, and bloom is that thing where light starts to wrap around objects and kind of lights them up. That is one of the nice defects of film. There's also different color spaces that you can work in. Most of the time when you're working in video spaces, you're working in 8-bit color, which is a very limited color palette, which means the gradations between dark areas and light areas might become, again, limited, might look crunchy, might look compressed. So when you can work in 16-bit, 24-bit, 36-bit color space, you have more colors and more gradations of a color yellow than what you might have had before. Film, unfortunately, can get scratched as it runs through either a projector or through a camera when it's being recorded. Those create two different types of scratches, white scratches or black scratches, depending on how it's post-processed. Also, dust, if somebody is not taking care of a camera, the dust can get on the film itself and cause problems. So we have to be careful with that. That's one of the reasons why, if you're working on a true film set, they will be checking the gate. Checking the gate ensures that the gate is clean and there's no problems, that the film was running through properly. So those kinds of things, the bloom, the larger color space, dust and scratches, those kind of defects give us hints that what we're looking at was shot on film. Video, on the other hand, it also has defects that are noticeable. One of the big defects that we have in video is something called aliasing, because remember, a pixel is not round, pixel is square. Film has grain, which is an organic crystal. And so if you try to draw a circle with a series of squares, you get a very stair-stepped circle all the way around. That's called aliasing. And so what we do in video, and this has been around since the very beginning, is we do something called anti-aliasing. We try to soften those edges up so that that stair-step pattern looks more smooth and more rounded, so that diagonal line doesn't look like a series of little stair steps, but actually looks like a straight diagonal line. So we've got aliasing problems in video that can make things look fake and not real. We also have other artifacts, the fact that we're working with just RGB channels and not something that is actually chemically reacting to the light that is being hit by it. We also have problems of strobing, depending on, again, what type of system you're looking at. If you're looking at an interlaced system, we really don't shoot with, or we really don't playback television on CRT machines, but if you've ever seen the old strobing effect, going back to Star Wars again, that strobing effect that you may have seen, the lines running through the holograms, that's kind of what happens in older televisions as the photon beam is being deflected by the giant magnet inside the CRT and scanning and rescanning, 60 times per second the screen. You can have those kind of artifacts as well, which again gives things a kind of a fakey look to them. So be aware of the defects between film and video and how they give us these subtle clues as to what we're seeing was either shot on film or whether it was shot on video. So here we get to the big solution. If you want it to look like film, you need to shoot it like film. We spent all this time talking about the differences between film and video. Now you want your video to look like film? Well then, shoot it like film. And what do I mean by shoot it like film? Well, one of the things that we can use to create a very film-like look is to use a shallow depth of field. Film typically has a shallow depth of field because we're dealing with something that has better sensitivity to light than video does. So we're able to open up that f-stop a great deal to something like f2, f1.8, f3, and so we're able to get a very shallow depth of field at that range, as opposed to what you're probably already encountering with your digital SLRs, where you have f4.8, f5.6, or if you're outside on a bright sunny day, you have to shoot at f11 or f22. If you are only able to shoot outside at f11 or f22, then you're going to have a very deep depth of field, meaning everything is relatively sharp focus. You can certainly mitigate that or fix that by putting neutral density filters in front of your lens that will darken the scene. It's kind of like, again, we've talked about neutral density filters before. Sunglasses for your camera, where it doesn't change the nature or the color of the light. It simply lets less light in, which means you have to open up that iris even more, which can give you that shallower depth of field. Okay. We've already talked about what affects your depth of field, certainly your focal length and your aperture. The best one is you can't always control your focal length, because if you can only, in the shot like this, if you need to get really close to that ball and still make it feel like a wide shot, you're going to be shooting at 24 millimeters. So you're going to have to close that aperture down or open that aperture up as much as you possibly can. Remember, with f-stop, the higher the number, the smaller the opening, and the lower the number, the bigger the opening. So use those neutral density filters when you can. You can always find neutral density filters that can screw onto the front of a lens or multiple lenses, or if you're using a matte box, you can buy glass or plastic, but preferably glass neutral density filters that you can just drop in front of that matte box and open things up. And you can get gradual neutral density filters, which you can drop in place, especially if you're shooting the sky, where you can make the sky a little darker and the ground normal, so you can open up your exposure there, maybe get a little bit more detail in the sky than you might normally have. But certainly shallow depth of field is one way. Using a shallow depth of field is one way to make your video look more film-like. Next thing you need to do, you need to light it like film. You know, highest lighting ratio is probably 3:1 in film. That's a lot. It's probably a lot lower than that. It may be 20:1, meaning that on a key light, if it's lit at, let's just say 100, the fill light would be 1/20th of that. It would be at 20. Or if the key light is lit at a unit 1, the fill light would be at a 200:1. It would be lit at 1/200th the intensity of that key light, and still make some very pretty lighting. You can go online. I've shared many videos in the past from Aperture and others on how to light using just a few lights or very little light. That is one thing that is a lot nicer now with our digital SLRs and our digital cameras, is that they are able to shoot in much lower light than what we have had before. Used to be that, man, in order to get a decent or even halfway decent image, you had to throw a lot of light into it if you were shooting on video. That's not the case today. So you can get away with a lot lower lighting ratios. And I would experiment with how low can you get that fill light in order for it to still fill in the shadows the way you want it. The other thing about lighting like film is, in video, you kind of had to light your entire area, right? With film, you want to use kind of pools of light. So if you are shooting a conversation of two people at a couch, and in the background you can see the kitchen and someone's working in the kitchen, then you would work really hard to light the people who are sitting on the couch to get them evenly lit, or lit however you want it for that particular scene. And then you would not light anything between the couch and the kitchen in the background, but instead you would light the person working at the kitchen island and light them completely separate from the people in the foreground. And then between the kitchen island and maybe the back counter, you would have no light. And then you might have some lights on the under-cupboard lights over the counter. So you would have 3 pools of light. You'd have a pool of light of people working at the couch, a pool of light of the person in the background working at the counter, and a person in the far background, the under-counter lights just lighting up the counter and providing a little bit of access and depth. This will help create depth in your scene and not make everything look so flat. Here's a good example of that, where we have, I think this is, I forget which film this is, but we see George Clooney in the foreground that he is lit, and then we have a lot of dark space, and then we have the person in the far doorway who's being lit, probably not as much, but then way beyond that is the actual background lighting. And we've created these pools of light throughout the scene that creates depth. And that's what we're ultimately looking for. Shallow depth of field and a lot of depth in our scene makes things look more cinematic. So here are some things that you can do to your video camera or your digital SLR. You can tweak the sharpness. You can lower the saturation to try to get a better contrast range. You can adjust your white balance. You can even throw off your white balance a little bit to give a warmer look or a cooler look. You could slightly underexpose so that you have more detail in the highlights that you can restore. But again, working with a digital SLR, you shoot in camera raw, have the capability of shooting in camera raw. A lot of this stuff is taken care of for you. One thing that people have suggested in the past is if I turn up the gain on my camera, that is going to create grain. It's going to create a grainy image, and therefore that's going to look a lot more film-like. Don't ever do that, okay? Gain is electronically enhancing the signal and increasing the signal-to-noise ratio of your image. Therefore, when you shoot in low light and you turn up the gain on your camera or you turn up the ISO on your digital SLR, you're just increasing the amount of noise. And noise is not grain. Remember, grain is a byproduct of the organic process of film, not just simply boosting the film so that it brings up more of that grain. So never use gain or never increase your ISO to create the illusion of grain. Use that in post-processing. There are a number of ways that you can soften your camera. One of them, obviously, as I've already mentioned, is you can turn down the sharpness filter, the internal filter on your camera. Another thing that you could do is you could use a soft filter. I talked a moment ago about using the neutral density gels or glass in front of your camera to bring up the need for more exposure. So you would have to open up your iris more, get that shallower depth of field. You can also buy soft filters for your camera that soften the image. And there's two types. There is a white soft filter, which gives you kind of a bloom effect for everything that you are using. The other one is called a black net filter. And the black net is kind of the opposite. Instead of using white, it uses black. And it's just a little grid pattern on the filter. And it causes the black areas to not be as sharp and contrasty. Most people tend to use the soft filter, the white one, that causes everything to bloom. Another trick that you can do to create your own soft filter, and this is a trick that's been used in Hollywood for decades, get a pair of sheer nude pantyhose, and then just take those pantyhose. You don't have to use the whole thing, right? But just take it and stretch it as tight as you can. I mean, super, super tight across the front of your lens so that those pantyhose holes open up and you get a really fine grid or a fine mesh on the pantyhose, and then rubber band secure it, whatever you need to do in the front of that lens. And that will create a natural soft filter just by using however much pantyhose costs these days. I can't remember. No need to use fishnets. Those aren't going to work, but just a pair of sheer or nude colored pantyhose stretched tight over that camera lens is going to create a really cool soft effect. You might also hear people say, use Vaseline on your lens. Don't ever put anything on your lens. Never, 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 never. But there was a trick that you can use a clear filter, okay, and then smear a very thin layer of Vaseline across that to kind of do the exact same thing. I wouldn't recommend it. It's messy. It takes a long time to clean up. And again, you don't ever want to put Vaseline on your lens. No, 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 no. But pantyhose, they do work wonders. And it's still used a lot today. So kind of keep that in mind. You can also change the shutter speed. Now, this is something that I've been talking about since your beginning video production, is that in order to create a natural blur that matches or mimics the way our eyes work or that film looks when it is being exposed, is that you want a 180-degree shutter. You don't have the ability in a video camera to adjust the angle of the shutter, although the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K and the 6K both have the ability to do that. Your typical digital SLRs and your video cameras do not. So what you want to do is take, and here's the easy formula to remember, is whatever your film speed is, or whatever your frame rate is, double that, and that is going to be your shutter speed. So if you are shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should not exceed 1/60th of a second. Okay. So 24 frames per second would be, I'm sorry, not 1/60th of a second. 1/48th of a second. Okay, so your shutter speed would be set to 1/48th. Problem is your shutter speed doesn't go in increments like that. It usually goes in increments of 10. So it'll be 30, 40, 50, 60. So what you then need to do is get the closest matching one. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, try to have your shutter speed no faster than 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter speed should be at 1/60th of a second. Okay? And that will get you that natural motion blur. And I know so many people today are overly concerned about shutter speed and frame rates, and the faster the frame rate, the more realistic it looks. One of the other problems that you can see, and you can go and check this out, there's some videos on YouTube where someone has taken old film from like 1908, 1906, and they've run it through an AI, which smooths out a lot of the juddering, smooths out a lot of the grain. It actually enhances the frame rate and speeds it up and enlarges everything so it's 4K. And when you look at it, this old film looks like video. It's very kind of disconcerting and jarring. Is it Trumbo? No, not Trumbo. I forget who the cinematographer is. He used to be part of Industrial Light and Magic, worked on Star Wars and a bunch of other films. He was experimenting with what happens if you shoot at a super high frame rate and, like 48 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, and you play it back at those speeds. What does it look like? The Hobbit movie was shot at these higher frame rates. And the weird thing is, it kind of looks like video. Even though you're shooting it on a film, it kind of looks like video, and it kind of turns off a lot of people. And it's because of that natural blurring that we all expect. Again, one of the artifacts of shooting on film that's been ingrained in our memories since we were young children, that is what film looks like. Now, I'm very interested to see, with newer generations, younger generations of people, that as they are raised on stuff that is shot at 60 frames a second, 120 frames per second, where shutter speeds have been reduced, or increased so high that you don't have that blurring. If they look at things like film as archaic, or that natural motion blur as archaic, and it doesn't look real to them, but they much more prefer, the video game effect where you're running at 120 frames per second or higher, and the refresh rate is really, really high. Be interesting, and maybe for some of you who go into graduate school, maybe that's something that you can test, which one people prefer. Because ultimately, that's what we're talking about, is audience preference. And if you're someone that says, I really enjoy the look of film, and you are someone who is sitting there saying, I want my video to look like film, but film is too expensive, I'm giving you tips and techniques that you can do to make your film or your video look more like film. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe what you really want is something that is super sharp, that has very little blur, that looks like a video game, or looks like 60 frame per second video that people are shooting and posting on YouTube. Maybe that's what you're really wanting your video to look like, in which case, all these things that I'm talking about, you don't need to pay attention to, right? Another thing that has changed over the years is the aspect ratio. The aspect ratio, of course, is the image height compared to the image width. Back in the day, and I say back in the day, prior to 2007, the aspect ratio for NTSC television was 4:3, a very square image. A lot of filmmakers like to shoot in a wider aspect ratio. Our HD TVs today are 16:9, a more rectangular image, which for landscapes looks really good. But a lot of cinematographers will want to shoot in not anamorphic, but in CinemaScope, which is like 2.85 to 1, which is a very, very wide aspect ratio. Some people like to shoot in the anamorphic aspect ratio. You can buy, and they're kind of expensive, you can buy anamorphic lenses or adapters for your digital SLR. There used to be a lot more in the video days, in traditional DV days and old video days. You used to be able to find the anamorphic lenses a lot easier. Today, they're a little bit harder to find, but you can still find them. And they are adapters or lenses that you can just put into place, and it squeezes the image vertically so that when you go into post, you have to stretch it back out. You have to stretch stretch the width of the image back out to create something that looks, correct. And so you get a very, very wide image. And we can have an intensive video production. We will have a lot bigger discussion on which lenses you use and which aspect ratios you shoot in, because everything doesn't have to be super CinemaScope. Everything doesn't have to be shot widescreen. Everything doesn't have to be shot, wider than 16:9 or an aspect ratio that's higher than 16:9, because it doesn't always work with every film. Used to be the John Ford films used to be shot widescreen because he wanted the landscape to be just as big a character in those old John Wayne Westerns as the characters themselves. And so having that wide aspect ratio allowed you to see all of the scenery of the Utah West, right? Something like Dances with Wolves, the old movie with Kevin Costner, is something that certainly works with a super wide aspect ratio because you want the landscape and the loneliness that this person is experiencing to be part of that story. But maybe if you're shooting your next Rocky movie, maybe you're shooting something that has a lot of action to it, maybe you don't need to see those wide landscapes unless the scenery is being part of that action. Maybe you don't need to shoot it super wide. So I would encourage you, as you start to move into the intensive video production course, look at some of your favorite films and look at what aspect ratio they are shooting in. Are they shooting in 16:9? Are they shooting at 1.85? Are they shooting at 2.83? What's that aspect ratio? And think about, why did they decide to shoot in those aspect ratios? And how does that impact the story that they're telling? One of the nice things, I want to skip over to the digital SLRs really quick. One of the nice things about the digital SLRs, especially full frame sensors, is that the very large chip size does help you get a shallower depth of field. The types of lenses that you can get are very close to cinema cameras. In fact, you can even put cinema cameras, cinema lenses. You can rent and buy cinema lenses to attach to digital SLRs. And so you can get an image quality that's very close to what you might see in digital film right there on your EOS Rs or whatever camera. The Blackmagic camera, for example, is a perfect example of this, to get that film look. All right, I think that wraps it up for this installment, for this lecture. Hopefully this gives you some ideas on how to make your film or your video more film-like. And maybe the next time you go and shoot, think about how you can incorporate some of this into your next project. Thanks so much for checking us out or listening to this lecture. If you have any questions, just let me know.